Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tech Forum Online. My name is Lauren Stewart, and I'm the Director of Operations and Customer Relations at BookNet. In this presentation, I will be covering the big standards updates from April 2023 to March 2024. Since there's so much to cover, particularly a 2023 BISAC update that will be of major importance to many publishers of Indigenous content, I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on that. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that BookNet's operations are remote and that our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space-making in the book industry. I encourage you to visit the native-land.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are joining from today. First up, I wanted to remind everyone that there is a dedicated page in BookNet's user documentation where we track updates to bibliographic standards of note to Canadian data senders and receivers. There's a pink QR code on the slide now. Bookmark this page as your destination for tracking bibliographic standards. We update it throughout the year, and you don't have to wait for this presentation each year to stay on top of things. The next place to keep an eye on is the BookNet Canada blog, where we regularly post not only updates, but practical applications and think pieces on various issues as they relate to standards, metadata, and more. There's a blue QR code on this slide for you to head over to the blog and take a look at what we have there. So, what was new for bibliographic standards in 2023 and 2024? First, of note is that ONIX 3.1 has been released. Release 3.1 takes all the key features of 3.0.8 and adds new data elements to provide the most frequently requested new functionality, but crucially, it drops support for a handful of deprecated data elements and the outmoded gender data element. For most data senders, upgrading to Release 3.1 should be very straightforward. Any 3.0 message that does not use any of the deprecated elements, including gender, is already 3.1 ready. It needs only a trivial change to make it valid, ONIX 3.1. So for data recipients, the difficulty of accepting 3.1, probably alongside 3.0 for some time, will depend on the data ingestion architecture, but it should not be greater than any other past revision of 3.0, i.e. upgrading from 3.02 to 3.03. Along with the update to 3.1, 5 new ONIX code lists 61 to 65, have been released over the past 12 months. Details of all of these can be found on the blog, and there are some major changes to several lists, including the list for language, which now includes several Indigenous languages not previously represented. Another update that we encourage you to take back to your marketing departments is BookNet and the Canadian National Bibliographic Committee's endorsement of BISG's statement on misuse of the title and subtitle fields. Coupled with editors' formal support of promotional headlines, endorsements, and cover lines in the ONIX code list, there is definitively no reason to include these elements in the title or subtitle fields of your ONIX records. The last update, the one that we're going to spend the rest of this presentation looking at, is the 2023 BISAC Subject Code release. 2023 was one of the largest releases in recent years, and we're going to walk you through it, especially because it's of immediate interest to publishers of Indigenous content. Before we get into it, a quick roundup. BISAC is a North American administered standard run by BookNet's sister organization, the Book Industry Study Group, the BISG, in the US. Important to note is that this is also used in parts of Central and South America. There are actually 3 types of BISAC. The first and most well-known are the BISAC subject headings, or codes. These describe the content of a book and were developed for publishers to communicate with retailers and the general book trade, the store section in which a title best fits and will sell best. There are also BISAC merchandising themes and BISAC regional themes. BISAC merchandising themes identify marketing opportunities for like-minded books insofar as content is concerned, and BISAC regional themes provide additional help in identifying books of specific geographical interest. Sometimes people compare the merchandising themes with Thema's Qualifier 5 list for interests, as they can be used to further describe fictional works that have been subject coded by genre. In addition, they are super helpful for planning sales and marketing plans for both publishers and retailers. BISAC regional themes are my personal favorite flavor of BISAC, as they are used to highlight location-specific opportunities for sales reps, bookstores, libraries, and media, and offer an opportunity to reinforce a book's location in metadata. But let's get to why you are all here, the BISAC subject headings. From this point on, if I mention BISAC, then you can assume that I'm referring to the subject codes and not the merchandising or regional codes. There are currently over 5,500 terms in the list spread across 52 major categories, each with detailed subtopics. There is a new list released each year, steered by the BISG Subject Code Committee. The Subject Code Committee consists of BISG members only, and all are volunteers. No one on the committee is paid for their participation. BookNet Canada is a BISG member and the designated Canadian market representative. We sit on the committee and are joined by one other Canadian representing a different BISG member. Personally, I have been formally representing BookNet since spring of 2022. The committee is tasked with reviewing sections or categories on a cyclical basis, adding or deleting codes as needed, and updating descriptions when warranted, as well as soliciting and reviewing requests for updates from the publishing community and committee members. There is a process for the annual list of changes. The committee meets once per month, every month from September to the summer. A final list of committee-selected proposals is submitted to and approved by BISG's Board of Directors in the fall of each year. The list is then released in November or December. Once released, it is up to the industry, i.e. publishers, distributors, retailers, and more, to implement the new list into their systems. This should happen as soon as possible following the release. If this sounds clunky and slow, please recall that this volunteer-run process has steered significant changes, such as the major change to the juvenile categories in 2015, when young adult was carved out and two new branches were born, young adult fiction and young adult nonfiction. Now, about the branches, since I have brought them up. It is worth confirming how BISAC is arranged. BISAC is arranged akin to the file systems you're familiar with from computers, or akin to a phylogenetic tree you may know from evolutionary diagrams, where there are ancestors and descendants. This system is suggestive of hierarchies, which poses some challenges, but I'll get back to that in a bit. And this brings us to the topic of the moment, looking at the BISAC subject codes for indigeneity. I wanted to share the work that BookNet has done for the 2023 release of the BISAC subject headings, and this continues work that has been done since 2018 to address terminology and representation in the BISAC list. Since 2018, BookNet has collected feedback and requests from mostly publishers and some retailers, as well as other supply chain participants. Across the board, supply chain participants identified gaps in representation and missing Indigenous worldviews. While some subjects did have Indigenous-specific codes, such as in fiction and in later years the juvenile and young adult categories, most of the 47 major headings had limited codes reflecting indigeneity. Where Indigenous subjects did exist, publishers confirmed they wanted increased granularity represented in those subjects, i.e. fiction Indigenous was not going to cut it. Moreover, even a cursory glance at the list exposed the conscious and unconscious bias in the headings and structure. Think about the hierarchical design that I talked about in the previous slide. All of this results in a persistent catch-22 for publishers of Indigenous content. You have to either select a subject code that does not represent indigeneity authentically to respond to market opportunities, or choose to honor Indigenous worldviews and have limited engagement with BISAC, which will therefore impact your access to entire markets, channels, and sales opportunities. We also had strong feedback from BISAC users following the release of a handful of new codes and changes that were made to the 2022 list. Particularly, Indigenous-owned and operated presses and the authors working with them passed along feedback and encouragement to continue. There was a clear call to see changes and new codes extended beyond the juvenile and young adult subject areas that were addressed in 2022. Here is a short history of terminology changes in BISAC. It is worth noting that BookNet and the BISG have tried to lead and respond to changes in terminology over the years. That change has indeed been slow, maybe even glacial, but you can see some progress has been made. Finally, the market for books classified as Indigenous, using the existing BISAC subject codes, continues to grow. So we assembled a working group with a public and often directed call for participants and involvement going out in late summer and fall of 2022. We started meeting in December 2022 with 13 meetings spanning until June 2023. We engaged cross-functionally and job title agnostically with firms. We worked with people making Indigenous books and not just the data people. We had 17 participants, and you can see their company names here. Important to our efforts was to work in collaboration with a US-based representative to be able to present a united front to the BISG Subject Code Committee when making our requests. We knew it would lend strength to our request to present a whole market request for North America, and we think it strengthened the ask. As our group met, several themes emerged from our initial discussions when evaluating the then current 2022 BISAC list. So let's get into those themes. The first theme we identified was a need for more codes, full stop. Before the 2023 list was released, only 30 codes existed across all 5,200 plus subject headings, leaving major gaps. Take, for example, this Chickasaw prayer book from Chickasaw Press, a member of our working group. This book encapsulates some of the problems with the currently available subject headings. This is a dual language prayer book for the Chickasaw, a federally recognized tribe in Oklahoma. The publisher selected 2 BISAC subject headings from those available: Foreign Language Study, Indigenous Languages of the Americas, and Religion, Prayer. Notable was what he chose not to select, the available Religion, Indigenous Folk and Tribal Code, which exposes the white supremacy inherent in the list. This need for more codes that reflect an Indigenous worldview becomes increasingly apparent as you spend lots of time working with the list, as many of you, as well as those in our working group, have. That feeling in our working group was that it shouldn't cut it to just add an Indigenous subheading under every major subject heading. Rather, the list needed to use appropriate terminology to reflect an authentically Indigenous approach to those topics. This brings us to our next reference text, Mother Earth Plants for Health and Beauty, Indigenous Plants, Traditions, and Recipes by Carrie Armstrong. The publisher, Eschia, and their distributor, Lone Pine, has the following codes assigned to this book: Body, Mind, and Spirit, Healing General, Crafts and Hobbies, Candle Making, Social Science, Indigenous Studies. The codes selected from the available codes at the time, then from the 2022 BISAC subject heading list, fail to robustly express the intimate connection between plant life, health, and healing through an Indigenous lens that is so clearly articulated in the text. Another major theme we identified was the need to distinguish between market participants, i.e. those in Canada, the US, and international. Working with a US-based publisher helped our group identify the nuances required to reflect the needs of the so-called US market, while also recognizing that Indigenous content may enter the so-called North American market from other parts of the world. And we know how important the Canadian market differentiation is for sales north of the border. Our working group did flag that this need for market differentiation does fly in the face of Indigenous worldviews. We're differentiating different Indigenous groups, and therefore content, according to a Canadian-US statehood division, is not straightforward nor respectful of Indigenous worldviews. Our working group agreed that an overarching challenge was that codes needed to be more visible, i.e. discoverable, by data providers and data recipients. They observed that some existing codes are third level and not easily located by subject coders in-house, nor located by buyers. And a known challenge is the tree-type structure of BISAC, the hierarchical model I mentioned before, and the supremacies and associations that are suggested because of this hierarchical system. Our working group also expanded its scope as time progressed and began examining the use of the word ethnic, where it appeared in existing codes and suggesting alternative language, as well as examining where some groups of people were subclassified in subheadings and others were not. One of the greatest challenges of the work that was done was to build a coding recommendation that would synthesize into the existing BISAC structure, as it was far too outside of the scope to restructure BISAC entirely, at least not at this time. We landed on an approach that I call the 3-branch methodology. This follows the existing approach in the young adult categories, where there are Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, and Native American subheadings. We also felt that this approach addressed the transnational issue that has been brought to BookNet in the past regarding the division of Indigenous headings across so-called Canadian and US state lines. Our intent is that, where further child subheadings are required, only the Indigenous branch would collect subheadings. What this looks like functionally is 3 branches, where the main Indigenous branch has subheadings, and then there are 2 additional subheadings to indicate a market content or further specify the Canadianness or Americanness of the book. Therefore, when one of the main subject code heading Indigenous codes are used to describe the book's content, the publisher could also select either that heading and then Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, or the same heading for Native American, effectively double coding with regional information. This conservative proposal, akin to double coding approaches used elsewhere in the list, does have its benefits. It enriches meaning and understanding of the selected Indigenous heading. It offers opportunities for market differentiation. It opens up opportunities in the future to add additional, more precise groups such as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And both non-branched headings could be used independently if there was not an appropriate Indigenous code to select, i.e., Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island or Native American. Finally, a publisher may choose to use BISAC merchandising themes to add additional granularity. The following codes are now all added from the 2023 list: Cultural Heritage First Nations, Cultural Heritage Métis, Cultural Heritage Inuit, Cultural Heritage Indigenous Peoples of Turtle Island, Event Powwow, Event National Indigenous History Month, Holiday Indigenous Peoples Day, Holiday National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or Orange Shirt Day. Hit up the QR code on this slide if you want to review the complete list. So let's look at all of the changes that were made for the 2023 edition. This is a high-level overview, but I'm trying to provide granularity where I expect the audience will need it. Our first task was to tackle the people and places trees in juvenile and young adult fiction and nonfiction categories. Again, remember that we were looking at the then current 2022 BISAC subject headings. When you look at the 2022 BISAC subject heading, the distinction and segregation of specific peoples into a separate heading implies an othering, where their identities are not presumed to be of the norm or the dominant or majority identity group. This mindset is harmful and marginalizing to creators, publishers, and retailers. An additional issue with the people and places branches was that they contained both regions and countries as well as people. Here were the people and places categories in juvenile fiction from the 2022 BISAC list. As you can see, regions, countries, and people. And here are the people and places categories as they were in young adult fiction. Very similar to the juvenile fiction list with slight variances, and you get the idea. I'm not going to repeat this for the juvenile nonfiction or young adult nonfiction lists. Now, I'm not going to be able to go over any of these in major detail, but I'm happy to confirm our request was successful. People and places is no more and has been reworked to places in all juvenile and young adult fiction and nonfiction categories. The people that were previously grouped under people and places are now top-level subheadings, i.e. juvenile fiction Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, juvenile fiction Native American, and more. This recommendation impacted 71 codes in total. This is considered a massive change, and we are thrilled it was successful. We took the successes of our pitch to the Subject Codes Committee concerning people and places and applied it to the so-called adult nonfiction category of biography and autobiography, where we advocated to pulling out the groups of people clustered under the cultural, ethnic, and regional subheading and making them top-level biography and autobiography categories, as you can see here. We're quite happy to see these changes in effect now that the lists have gone live. Our second task was to tackle the much-loathed Legends, Myths, and Fables code in juvenile and young adult fiction. Now, Legends, Myths, and Fables, which appears as a branch in both juvenile and young adult fiction. Reports to BookNet Canada asserted that Indigenous-owned and operated firms avoided this code as they felt it was disrespectful to their peoples. For many Indigenous cultures, their stories, teachings, and values make up their worldview, that of a living culture, and the connotation of being grouped with legacy, historical, or fictional cultures was offensive and harmful. Moreover, grouping into an omnibus code that includes all three components, legends, myths, and fables, suggests that these stories, including sacred stories, are untrue. This perpetuates colonial and Eurocentric ways of thinking that Indigenous worldviews do not deserve to be upheld in the same way as others. After all, BISAC codes do not consider Christian worldviews to be legends, myths, or fables. That would be disrespectful to beliefs of that community. As an aside, just for those of you tracking some stats, there were only 151 Legends, Myths, and Fables Indigenous peoples in the Americas ISBNs that had sales tracked in our sales data tracking service since 2004. and fewer than 27% of those were from Indigenous-owned and/or operated firms. Indigenous-owned and/or operated firms defer to and prefer to use alternative codes, especially considering the options available from the codes we added in 2022. So, here were the legends, myths, and fables in the juvenile and young adult fiction sections. Looking at the subheadings under legends, myths, and fables, we found there were three types: legacy, living, and fictional. Seeing these grouped together reveals the offense. Living cultures' histories are being grouped together with the made-up stories and ancient tales of cultures no longer with us. Recall that these are all grouped currently under fiction categories as well. So, while you will have to recode your books that currently use this code, BookNet can and will assist. I have a list ready that I can send with ISBNs using this code that I am happy to share. Just email me at lauren@booknetcanada.ca and I'll send it over. Next, let's look at the changes that you can see now in the adult fiction list for the 2023 edition. The 2022 code list only had one code for Indigenous fiction, Indigenous. So first up, let's look at the changes to existing codes. The aforementioned solo code is being converted into a general, which, yes, confirms that our three-branch methodology is in effect and there are exciting new subheadings to share. Next up are all of the new codes you can look forward to reflect the many genres of Indigenous storytelling. While this is not all-encompassing, the ones I am most excited about that are newly added are Elders, Indigenous Futurism, and Life Stories. There are a total of 19 new fiction codes relating to indigeneity, so you never have to use fiction general again. Notable on this slide are the new Indigenous Peoples of Turtle Island and Native American codes, according to our three-branch methodology. These can be added as a secondary or tertiary code to suggest Canadian or US content. So your Indigenous Futurism book could also have an Indigenous Peoples of Turtle Island code too to suggest so-called Canadianness. Also notable on this list is the inclusion of Two-Spirited and Indigiqueer under the erotica, LGBTQ+, and romance branches. Similarly, we have a stack of new codes for juvenile fiction. The 2022 code list only had the following juvenile fiction codes reflecting indigeneity. Many of these have already changed, as discussed. Now, thanks to our working group's efforts and the subjects approved by the BISAC Subject Committee, we have so many more new codes for juvenile fiction, 17 to be precise. Here you can see the ones we've branched under Indigenous, including cautionary tales, which has a nuanced difference from horror, as well as oral stories and retellings, which were necessary subcategories that our working group felt addressed a number of titles on the market. Three codes that we didn't expect to have added were First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I believe I mentioned before that we felt we assembled a conservative ask for new codes, and we did not include these three as we didn't expect the Subject Codes Committee would be open to such a large request for new codes, as they traditionally try to limit the overall size of the list. However, this was suggested by a Subject Code Committee member and approved for addition. You will see these elsewhere in the list in the YA fiction and nonfiction lists, as well as juvenile nonfiction and the merchandising themes. We're thrilled to see them. Another code we're proud of is the one for trickster tales, something that extends beyond Indigenous storytelling and was appealing to the Subject Code Committee as well. And in keeping our eyes on the use of the word ethnic, a change to an existing juvenile fiction category was approved. Fairy tales and folklore, country and ethnic, is now country and cultural. This change was also made in the young adult fiction section. Similarly, the 2022 code list only had the following young adult fiction codes relating to indigeneity. You can see those here. These were the available codes reflecting indigeneity in the young adult fiction list from 2022. Many of the 21 codes that we advocated for in this section are familiar from what we discussed in adult fiction and juvenile fiction, so I'm not going to spend much time here. Young adult is a genre-heavy category, and we paid attention to the detailed categorization that was possible here. Of note here is that comics and graphic novels has 3 new categories. Plus, we advocated for the branching of LGBTQ+, which allowed us to add the aforementioned Two-Spirited and Indigiqueer category that you saw in adult fiction. So let's look at juvenile fiction next. Similarly, the 2022 code list only had the following juvenile nonfiction codes reflecting indigeneity, which have all been discussed and reworked. We are adding 18 new juvenile nonfiction categories with the 2023 BISAC Subject Code release. Of these, I'd like to flag the land-based knowledge and reconciliation codes, which will be of interest to many of the publishers watching. We spent a large amount of time considering the religion section, of which you can see the results here. A tactical decision was made to use the known BISAC term of religion, with the expectation this would increase discoverability and sales opportunities. It was one compromise we felt was necessary to confirm the respect that these topics deserve, to differentiate the books, to be able to get further granular and reflect Indigenous beliefs, while balancing the Subject Code Committee's desire to constrain titles about belief and spirituality into either body, mind, and spirit or religion categories, neither of which Indigenous spirituality feels particularly aligned with. I'll touch back on this later. We also constructed a tree in young adult nonfiction that mirrors this. We restructured the 2022 code for teachings and traditions to fit into our religion reorganization and addressed the use of the word ethnic in biography and autobiography, which we also did in the young adult nonfiction section. And we successfully advocated for the rename of foreign language study to just language study, arguing that the use of the word foreign does nothing to better identify the section and is offensive. We made these changes, as you can see here, in the juvenile nonfiction section as well as in young adult. And this work will not stop with the 2023 list, as we have already started work to advocate for additional changes to this and other sections in the BISAC list concerning languages. Similarly, we have a stack of new codes for young adult fiction. These were the available codes in the 2022 list reflecting indigeneity in young adult nonfiction, with some of the changes here. And we successfully added 17 codes to this category, and you will see shared terms from earlier slides where I discussed the juvenile nonfiction codes. So let's move into so-called adult nonfiction, which we consider all codes that are not fiction or in the juvenile or young adult categories. Note that neither the term adult nor nonfiction appear anywhere in the BISAC list, but I'll use them because I feel it helps keep us on the same page. These were the only available codes reflecting indigeneity in adult nonfiction, 14 codes across 47 major headings. First, let's look at religion, as I recently covered some of our working group's discussions when we looked at the juvenile nonfiction codes a few slides ago. Our first step was looking at the current Indigenous, Folk, and Tribal Code, which we successfully advocated to remove the Indigenous element to aid us in building out a robust religion tree. You can see that tree here and our three-branch approach in effect. I'd like to discuss art next, which I think shows the dedication and skill of the working group and the recommendations made to the Subject Code Committee. You can see here in the first 3 lines our proposed 3-branch approach was successful, and we have 3 branches. We also successfully advocated for codes for basketry, beadwork, leatherwork and hidework, quill work, textiles, and weaving. We very tactically proposed these techniques for the art category and not crafts and hobbies to confer the respect they command. In the use notes for the crafts and hobbies category, the BISG directs users to use subjects in crafts and hobbies for works discussing technique from a craft as opposed to a fine art viewpoint. We wanted to be sure that Indigenous artistic accomplishments were elevated above the craft assignation that they are so commonly given. We also advocated for a restructuring of the history subcategory to remove the Eurocentricity of its structure. You can see that some of the major European time periods are now grouped under European, and a new Indigenous art history code is now introduced. History proved to be one of the longest discussions we had as a working group, and you can see our results here. We considered a number of methodologies, but decided on a classification system for history that de-emphasized dates and state-based geographies and focused on widely represented experiences of groups from across the continent. This work resulted from consultations with archaeologists and historians associated with our working group's members' firms. We're interested to have BISAC's user feedback on these new codes particularly to see if we hit the mark. And we have the aforementioned Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and Native American codes that a subject coder can use to double code a book to flag its Canadianness or Americanness. Similarly, for political science, we discussed this over several meetings and landed on the following codes. And we're not entirely sure that we've encapsulated all of the possible subheadings for this category, so we look forward to your feedback to see what changes could be made to the list in 2024 and beyond. Our three-branch approach is seen in the drama, literary collections, and the literary criticism and poetry sections. You're only seeing one poetry code here, as there are existing codes for Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and Native American poetry. Our work in the fiction categories, as discussed before, informed the recommendations that we made for the so-called adult comics and graphic novels section. And again, keeping our attention to the misuse of the word ethnic across the list, we advocated for the 45 codes under the regional and ethnic subheading in cooking to be reclassified as regional and cultural. We advocated for changes in line for the ethnic studies section under social science, but we were not successful in that regard, as ethnic studies does continue to be a term used widely in academia. However, we were able to reposition them as cultural and ethnic studies. And here you can see the three-branch approach in effect for the cooking category and the social science category. You're not seeing the Indigenous Studies code here, as it's already on the social sciences list. I've collected many of the other changes here that you can see when you browse the live list. I think there will be some interesting and provocative categories that will be of interest to publishers and data receivers, including 2 codes in family relationships, Indigenous health and healing codes in the health and fitness, medical, and self-help categories, and language arts and discipline/orality. And here's the last batch of note. The ones I'd like to flag are the 2 nature codes, cultural botany and Indigenous stewardship, as well as Indigenous knowledge and perspective codes in the science and technology and engineering categories. And that's my wrap up for the 2023 BISAC subject list. Our work is not yet done. We have an aggressive list of work to do over the coming months and years, not only for BISAC, but for all standards considerations. Some of the things that our standards team will be working on includes how to reflect Indigenous geographies, looking at the BISAC regional themes, thema, and then other places in product metadata. We also have to continue our work on examining Indigenous worldview in the BISAC list, particularly considering the settler approach to pan-indigeneity, navigating the fiction and nonfiction divide, as well as evolving terminology, as well as ongoing ethical considerations of all of this work. All of this culminates here with a thank you to the dozens of people who volunteered and informed the work of our working group, as well as those who volunteered and considered our proposal working on the BISG Subject Code Committee. Hundreds of codes added and changed would have not been possible without the efforts of all of these people. And this is meant to be a soft reminder that BookNet is a nonprofit organization and we work for you. We want you to participate. We need active stakeholder groups discussing these problems. That is how change happens. And we need your feedback on these BISAC changes regarding indigeneity, as well as other issues that you identify in the supply chain. I leave you with a quote from our colleague, BookNet's venerable bibliographic manager, Tom Richardson, that lives rent-free in my head, as the kids say. All forms of categorization are colonization against identity. We are always thinking about this work and ensuring that we are balancing requests for sales tools with a keen eye to preventing further acts of systemic racism and harm to Indigenous peoples as well as other equity-seeking communities. And we need to work with you. Thank you. If you'd like to be in touch about anything we've discussed here, or if you have suggestions or feedback on anything you've seen today, our email is standards@booknetcanada.ca. And if you'd like to stay abreast of updates regarding standards, as well as anything else that BookNet is working on in terms of our products and services, you can sign up to our newsletters at booknetcanada.ca/newsletter-sign-up. Thanks a lot and have a great day.